Hello, everyone. I am Mohamad Tavakoli, the inaugural director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. I welcome you all to our open public discussion on women, life, liberty, Mahsa Amini, women's movement, and the future in Iran. This panel is sponsored by York University's Department of History and the Iranian Women's Organization of Ontario. I'm grateful to Professor Leila Pourtawaf and Dr. Fariba Bashiri for their invaluable support. The September 16th death of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman at the hands of the morality police in Tehran, has brought into open public view a national-wide women's movement that challenges the ethical and moral foundation of Iran's patriarchal theocratic regime. The escalating demonstrations since Mahsa's death are daily plebiscites against compulsory veiling and Iran's patriarchal regime. This protracted movement is rejecting the veil as a symbol of male-dominant political order. Unlike earlier movements, this intensifying and escalating popular women's resistance includes Iran's megacities and tiny towns as elementary and high school girls are placing women's choice at the center of Iranian political life, a life free from patriarchal violence. This is well captured in the movement's commitment to women, life, liberty, zan, zindagi, azadi. We can see the autonomous movement of Iranian women as embodying a global moment of enthusiasm, signaling the resurgence of women as agents and global subjects and senior partners in new social movements, whereas previous social political movements of 18th, 19th, and 20th century were largely grounded on fraternity, brotherhood, and equality of men. This autonomous women's movement is the harbinger of a future that rejects patriarchal violence and promises a world in which women's choice shapes the content of an emerging new social and political order. Before we start, and at the outset, I like to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto and Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across the Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to teach and learn on their ancestral homeland. I'd like to welcome our panel participants, Professors Homa Hoodfar, Mona Tajali, Shahrzad Shams, Nima Naghibi, and Dr. Fariba Bashiri. My colleague, Professor Pourtawaf of York University, will be introducing our speakers one at a time and will moderate today's session on women, life, liberty, Mahsa Amini, women's movement, and the future in Iran. Professor Pourtawaf.
Thank you, Dr. Tavakoli, and thanks to all of our guests, and thanks to all of our speakers who agreed on such short notice to participate in this event. As Professor Tavakoli mentioned, I'm going to not have any preliminary remarks myself. I'm going to keep this brief. I'm going to introduce the speakers one at a time. They'll each speak for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we will open the floor up for discussion. We ask that everyone please keep their Zoom on mute while this is happening. And when the question period comes, I'll kind of give the parameters for how we're gonna do that section in order to keep it moving and keep it smooth. So without further ado, we'll be starting with Professor Homa Hoodfar. Professor Hoodfar needs no introduction for many of you, but to those of you who may not know her, she is a professor of anthropology emerita at Concordia University. Professor Hoodfar has also been actively involved in research and publication division of the Women Living Under Muslim Laws Network, whose mission has been to promote gender equality and plural democracy since the 1980s. Her research and publications have focused on anthropology of political economy, reproductive rights, Afghan refugees in Iran and Pakistan, women in formal and informal politics, hijab and clothing as political institutions, gender and citizenship, Muslim women's sports as politics, and gender and public sphere in Muslim contexts, and a lot more. So I'll just pass the mic on to Professor Hoodfar.
Well, thank you. Greeting everyone, and thank you to for the Iranian Studies to organize this session. And especially Dr. Tavakoli, that is always manages to get us all in line for discussion. Today, I know that my colleagues, especially Mona and probably Fatemeh, are going to discuss and analyze the situation historically, but I just want to use the privilege of my age and start my talk with an anecdote. In 1979, just a day after a few weeks after Khomeini entered Iran, made hijab compulsory on the 7th of March. On the 8th of March, women launched the largest women's demonstration against the compulsory hijab. And of course, unfortunately and regretfully, none of the organizations supported women at the time. In fact, many actively prevented women from participating. So, and a few weeks later, of course, other limitations like family law was canceled, women's life and evidence became half as much as men's, stoning as a punishment of zina was introduced, and many others, which women protested. Now, back forward, at the time I was living in Manchester, where student movement was very strong. In a political meeting, just a couple of months after these, the revolutionaries criticized women for the demonstration, for opposition, because on the ground that this is an anti-imperialist regime, women are weakening this, and we have to support this to be successful. The discussion went on and got heated, and I couldn't believe with the ease that all these comrades and friends, they write off women's rights so easily just to be anti-imperialist. In the heat of discussion, I shouted, if this anti-imperialist regime is taking away the limited right that imperialism is willing to give me, then viva imperialism. You can imagine at those atmospheres, the situation happened. At that time, I had not yet heard the quote that is associated with Emma Goldman that says, if I can't dance in a revolution, that is not my revolution. Years later, in fact, decades later, when I came to know this, I always remembered, if I only knew it then, I could have said it so much better. So having given you that expression, I know when I watch women dance around the fire and throw their scarves and men stand in their support, I just feel this is a revolution. This is my revolution. This is a revolution that has happened. It's not only that, it's men are supporting women, hijabi and non-hijabi women are standing together, women from metropolitan cities and a small town, people from different ethnic groups. So they have come together to say no to this regime. To me, this is the beginning of an uprising that if we nurse it well, if we take care of it, can deliver maybe this democratic system, political system that Iranian have fought at least from the end of 19th century onward, have gone through several revolutions, and each time we have ended up with not having the democracy we desired or the freedom we wanted. And in fact, the last revolution, as far as I am concerned as a woman, it was a disaster. So I leave it to colleagues to discuss and give us more. I'm really eager to hear how other people analyze the situation. To me, at this stage, regardless of what happens in terms of what happens to regime, I think the revolution has started and revolution has happened. The change in attitude and the way people have come together, for me, this is the base of the revolution to come, whether or not this regime is there or not. Well, I think my 5 minutes is over, so I leave it to Yode. I'm eager to hear what my colleagues have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hoodfar. Next, we'll have comments by Professor Mona Tajali. Mona Tajali is an associate professor of international relations and women's studies at Agnes Scott College. She's the author of the recently published book, Women's Political Representation in Iran and Turkey, Demanding a Seat at the Table, which I believe we'll be hosting a book talk for sometime soon. Her first book, Electoral Politics, Making Quotas Work for Women, was co-authored with Professor Hoodfar and has been translated into Persian and Arabic. She publishes her research findings in both academic and popular outlets, among them the Middle East Studies Journal, Politics and Gender, Journal of Women, Politics and Policy, The Conversation, and Jadaleya. Professor Tajali.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I just wanted to echo what Professor Hoodfar said with great thanks to those that organized us. I am so incredibly impressed by the amazing audience that we have. And I'm also incredibly impressed with the sort of intellectuals and amazing scholars that we have among us. So yes, I will go ahead and keep my remarks very brief to just 5 minutes, 5 to 6 minutes. And because I know there's just so much to talk about, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So I just wanted to sort of pick up from where Homa left it, in the sense that what we're seeing take place right now, ever since mid-September until now, it's important to keep in mind that it's sort of a continuation of sort of decades-long sort of organizing, protests, resistance, particularly by women, but also by other groups, in the sense that women and many others have sort of laid the ground for these grievances to be able to be uttered in a public forum in this regard. And the reason why I say the ground has been laid, I also want us to highlight that the ground has been laid not just by women from outside of sort of formal state structures in Iran, not just secular feminists. I think they played a major role from within Iran. I mean, we know that during the reform era from 1997 to 2005, we saw a major political opening that allowed women's rights groups to really organize, to be able to find a platform, to establish NGOs, to run women's journals, to be able to really publicly articulate some of their grievances. But thanks to those pressures, and again, not just during the reform era, prior to that as well, we saw that women, even from within the state structure, begin to take some of these grievances on. And in fact, the Iran that we have today in terms of its gender policies, it's not the Iran that we had in 1979, and there have been some changes. So in my own research, I have been able to find and document the moments where we had women come together across ideological spectrum, which I think is absolutely important, and we need to take into account that this is not to represent sort of an anti-Islam or, it's not a monolithic sort of stance that many of these protesters are taking, but rather it's quite intersectional. And the reason why we're seeing women being at the forefront is because, obviously, as Homa mentioned, the conservative gender ideology of the regime has really been able to center its ideology on women's bodies, the same way that we saw it during the extreme secularization of the Pahlavi era, like the forced unveiling that we saw, which was again playing itself out on women's bodies, but also to recognize that a lot of these sort of protests have been happening, have laid the ground, and why we're seeing women at the forefront with women, life, liberty as their slogan, it has actually led to energizing other groups to also come and highlight their grievances. So I think there are a few things that we need to keep in mind, that these protests are sort of a continuation from previous ones, while at the same time they sort of mark something new and a major success that I really want to give credit to the Iranian women, particularly the young, particularly the youth, is that they've been able to articulate to the larger population, particularly to the men, that their demands for women, life, and liberty is sort of part and parcel with the larger demands for democracy, for human rights, and for rule of law. And this is the moment that if we saw 2017 protests for economical crises, if we saw 2019 for sort of environmental disasters, this is where a lot of other groups who also have grievances have felt energized to finally come into the streets and really show their solidarity. And I think this is something that we need to keep in mind. The other thing I wanted to mention is, of course, that as someone who studies politics and political institutions, I'm also very much aware that state crackdown is quite serious. And this is what we're seeing happen right now, right? We're seeing it on university campuses. We're seeing it, and it should come as no surprise to any of us here why we're seeing this on university campuses, right? So we are seeing that, and that's quite worrying. And I think what, again, these politicized and mobilized sections of the society, the women, the youth, ethnic minorities from diverse regions of Iran, now is the time where those discussions are being had on how to move forward, and how to go about these important changes. And I think civil disobedience is another thing that we will probably likely see happen more and more, where women are just not going to necessarily be wearing the headscarf or doing different things in order to challenge the regime, and also other forms of solidarity, while they're sort of keeping these discussions on how to demand and actually see some of these substantive changes. But I completely recognize that we will not be able to predict what will happen, but I think these are some of the key points that I just wanted to highlight for us to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tajali. Next up, we have Professor Fatemeh Shams. Professor Shams is an assistant professor of Persian literature at the University of Pennsylvania. Her work focuses on the intersection of literature, politics, and society. Her critical monograph, A Revolution in Rhyme, Oxford University Press, came out in 2021 and is a comprehensive study of the intersection of poetry and politics in post-revolutionary Iran. Professor Shams is currently the Humboldt Foundation UMI Fellow, hosted by Forum Transregional Studien in Berlin in the 2021-2022 year. She's also an internationally acclaimed award-winning poet and has so far published 3 collections of poetry in both Persian and English. Professor Shams, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you very much. I'm no longer a Humboldt Fellow. I'm back in the States, but I was until 2 months ago. Well, thank you so much for having me here. I just, I know that we don't have much time, so I would like here to focus on just a couple of points that I think are very, very important to be highlighted, and then hopefully leave the rest for the Q&A. Since my interest is in the slogans and in rhyme and in a revolution in rhyme. And the title of this panel is the central slogan of this movement, which is Woman Life Freedom, Jan Zendegi Azadi, Jan Jian Azadi, or Zan Zendegi Azadi. I would like to, and thanks to Dr. Hoodfar for bringing that wonderful anecdote, which fits really, really well with what I wanted to say, is that I would like us to take a look at the slogans of the Women's March back in March 8, 1979 together. And then I will make my remark that what kind of changes and transformations I see in this particular movement that we are watching. Can everyone see that? Okay, so I will just show very short footages of the documentary Jombesh Azadi Zanan, directed by Claude Mollard in 1979, made in France. So it's on DocuNight, and I highly recommend it if you haven't seen it. It's a 12-minute documentary, extremely informative and very inspiring for a time like this. I rewatched it in the past few days when I saw that one of the slogans here, which I will point out to later, was being circulated after the brutal killing of Nika Shah Karami and delivering her body to her family. Over the past 48 hours, I saw this, one of the slogans here have been circulating on Twitter.
Le 8 mars, à Téhéran, 50 000 femmes iraniennes dans les rues, et partout dans le monde, des milliers de femmes qui se réjouissaient de la naissance d'un mouvement de libération des femmes dans un pays islamique. Dès le premier jour, et pendant toute cette semaine de révolution des femmes, 4 d'entre nous étaient avec elles dans les rues. Manifestations, sit-ins, discussions, réunions. Et nous étions nombreuses à Paris, Lyon, Bordeaux, Marseille et d'autres villes, à mettre toutes nos forces à faire connaître leur mouvement. Nous avons transmis jour après jour leur révolte, leurs fêtes, leur violence, leur victoire. Nous, les femmes du mouvement de libération des femmes, pratiques politiques et psychanalyse, qui affirmons que quand des femmes iraniennes brisent leurs chaînes, ce sont des femmes du monde entier qui avancent avec elles.
Le 8 mars n'est ni un jour de l'Est, ni un jour de l'Ouest, c'est un jour mondial. À l'aube de la Révolution, les femmes sont oubliées. Nous sommes des femmes iraniennes, nous ne resterons pas enchaînées. Sans la libération des femmes, la Révolution n'a aucun sens. D'autres slogans, nous ne voulons pas de voile obligatoire. Les femmes luttent et leurs luttes sont victorieuses. La police a tiré des coups de feu en l'air et essayé de les faire reculer. Les femmes ont crié « Nous n'avons pas peur, nous n'avons pas peur ». Et ce jour-là, dans Téhéran, partout, les femmes discutent passionnément. Une femme qui ne porte pas le voile nous a dit « Manifester dans les rues contre le voile, ça a été l'occasion d'une grande tendresse et d'une grande solidarité entre nous. Le voile, c'est une histoire d'hommes. C'est incroyable. Ce sont toujours les hommes qui défendent le voile. »
Nous, les femmes, nous avons eu des martyrs comme les hommes. Nous avons lutté avec le voile et sans voile pour notre liberté et pour celle du peuple. Et si Khomeini continue ainsi, moi qui suis une vraie musulmane, je quitterai ma religion.
Qu'est-ce que c'est un chador pour une femme? Oui, ce que ça... Oui, comment ça les entrave? Enfin, quel genre de vêtements c'est?
Il y a des années que je mets le tchador. Le tchador m'empêche de bouger, de travailler, de tenir mon enfant par la main. Mais je ne suis pas venue à la manifestation pour ne plus mettre le tchador. J'ai 6 filles et je suis venue pour que mes filles ne soient pas obligées de mettre le tchador, pour que les hommes ne l'obligent pas à le mettre. Je suis venue ici pour défendre mes filles contre le tchador.
Okay, so one of the slogans that have been circulating in the past 48 hours is the one that says لحظه به لحظه گفتم زیر شکنجه گفتم یا مرگ یا آزادی. I said it every moment. I said it under the torture, either death or freedom. And the other one is a response to one of the central slogans of the Islamic Republic, which was نه شرقی نه غربی جمهوری اسلامی. And they chant neither east nor west, global freedom. And also another one, which is استقلال آزادی جمهوری واقعی, independence, freedom, real republic. Another one, which because we don't have time, I didn't show it. It is مرگ بر سانسورچی, down with the censor. And the other one is درود بر پرستار, or long live nurses. And then I think, so the points that I want to make, these are mostly the Tehrani women taking to the march, and these what I consider as radical slogans of this movement. And what we see sometimes, I hear these days that they say the women movement have been radicalized. I think women movement in Iran has always been radical, and you can see that in the slogans of this movement back in 1979. The reason that it was oppressed, in my opinion, was because this transnational wing was, as strong as we can see today, this powerful transnational mobilization and transnational feminist movement that we see as a result of mass migrations over the past 4 decades. A lot of women activists, a lot of brilliant minds who couldn't, stay in Iran, and either forcefully or voluntarily migrated over the past 4 decades. And now they're scattered around the world. What we saw in Saturday in the international march against the Islamic Republic around the world, I think what is a dimension, added the extra dimension to this movement, that and also the voice that you're hearing from different feminists across the world, is something that didn't exist back in 1979. And I think another difference is that the movement, the central slogan of this time, comes from the Kurdish women grassroots mobilization groups. And I think this is extremely important. We shouldn't miss out on the fact that how important these women in Syrian and Iraqi and Turkish and Iranian territories are. And the fact that the slogan comes from the movement, I think, tells us about how pervasive this movement over the past 4 decades have become. It's no longer just a march in Tehran. I think it's all over the country. It's in the city of a small city like Saqqez, it's in Baluchistan, it's in Mashhad, it's in Kashmar. For those of us who have been following the news, seeing videos coming out of Kashmar, for me personally, was just mind-boggling, because it's a town that I traveled to a lot as a kid when I lived in Mashhad, and I know how religious and closed and conservative that city is. And the fact that women are coming out and making bonfires and throwing their veil out, or chanting slogans, is just incredible. So I think the pervasiveness is important, and this comes out of the central slogan of this movement, where it comes from and its origin. And just to say that I really just want to echo Dr. Hoodfar, that we really need at this point to nourish and take care and cherish and protect this important moment. This is a moment where the youngest generation of Iranian women are revolting against the system. This is a moment where the children who are 16, 17 years old are being brutally killed, kidnapped, raped, and their bodies are being returned to their families and stolen in the corpse houses and buried secretly. I'm talking about Nikah Karami. This is a news that has shaken this movement over the past 48 hours. I see it as a response. This brutal murder of Nikah Karami. I think that Mahsa Amini's death probably was, there were several blows on the head, but probably it wasn't deliberate. And now they're making it very deliberate. They're telling us that we are actually ready to deliberately, brutally kill. And so, they're showing the true face of this heinous apparatus of power that we have been dealing with over the past 44 years. And I think this is a moment of transnational unity. It's extremely important to remain united. A couple of hours ago, one of the internet celebrities who is a programmer, works on security web, Jadimi Mirani, who has been teaching Iranians, millions of them online, how to use internet, how to use internet responsibly and safely. They just raided his house without showing any verdict, and they took him away. Because, I think that Khamenei's speech the past couple of days, it was a response to the transnational protests on Saturday. His overtly and dangerously militant binary opposition between the police academy and the Sharif University of Technology was very, very clear. And these arrests are extremely, alarming. I think they have reached a point that they know that internet is what is extremely important. But again, I think personal narratives and stories are very important. I was talking to Dr. Tavakoli right before this panel, and both of us agreed on the fact that these various different generations of women, and this is not just the generation that was born in the 2000s, the generation that have been born before and after the revolution, women have gone household to household to revolt against their first fathers and parents. Then after that in the school, then after that against the state patriarch. They have come a long way. And this is really, when I say the turning point, I really mean it. It's not just a sort of a passing comment. This is a turning point, because here we are, women are face to face with the state patriarch, and they're telling the state patriarch that we don't want you. So I'll stop there. Sorry, I went, I think, a bit beyond time. Thank you.
No, thank you, Professor Shamson. Apologies for the interruption. I just want to remind everyone to please do keep your mics on mute while the speakers are speaking. Okay, next we have Professor Nima Naghibi. Professor Naghibi is a professor of English at Toronto Metropolitan University. She's the author of Rethinking Global Sisterhood, Western Feminism and Iran, as well as Women Right Iran, Nostalgia and Human Rights from the Diaspora. She has published essays and book chapters on the intersection of Western and Iranian feminism, diasporic Iranian memoirs and life narratives, and intergenerational trauma. Professor Naghibi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I just want to echo what all the panelists have said so far. My gratitude to Dr. Tavakoli for convening this gathering and just providing us a space to talk about this important issue. I'm so honored to be part of this panel with such respected scholars. So thank you all so much. I'm going to be, I think, echoing a lot of the things that have been said already. We keep coming back to 1979 and the feminist protests of March 1979. And I think it's obviously an important date for us to think about. So I'd just like to say a few words about how today's feminist protests mobilized around the figure of Mahsa Amini both invoke that moment and also demonstrate how importantly different this moment is from 1979. I think it's also important to remember that Iranian women's feminist activism and their demand for bodily autonomy has a long history. The first documented protest against enforced veiling was in the 19th century by Tahireh Horatolain, who paid the price of unveiling with her life, not unlike what's happening today, not unlike what's happening to young women like Mahsa Amini, Hadis Najafi, Nika Shokarami, and many others. So if we look to the past, we see several key moments when Iranian women resisted state-imposed measures on their bodies, and I'll just mention a couple here. In 1936, when Reza Shah imposed the Mandatory Unveiling Act, women who wanted to wear the veil simply refused to go out in public, which was its own form of civil disobedience. Under a regime that demanded and required women's visibility as a way of showcasing the country's supposed modernity and progress, women's resistance manifested itself through this deliberate removal of themselves from the public sphere. So in this instance, women's invisibility or absence from public life undermined that image of Iran that Reza Shah wanted to project to the rest of the world. And then throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, we see that Iranian women have been key figures and agents of change in the public sphere during the tobacco protest, the Constitutional Revolution, and then, of course, the 1979 revolution. But we see that despite this long history of feminist activism in Iran, women's voices, women's demands have been consistently forced to take a back seat to what were seen as the more urgent political issues of the day. And that's why this moment feels so different from the past. In 1979, as we know, women played a key role in the success of the revolution, but were repeatedly told that women's issues needed to be secondary to the larger project of redressing economic and social inequalities. Now, women's rights and feminist principles of equality are placed unapologetically at the heart, indeed the forefront of this movement. No longer taking a back seat to the other more pressing issues of a resistance movement, these women, some of them as young as 14 or 15, are leading the way for change, and they're bringing with them supporters from a broad spectrum of society, at home and internationally. Another way, I think, in which this moment feels different from the feminist protests in March 1979 is that at that time, the Iranian feminist movement was hindered by a well-intentioned but ultimately, I think, kind of destructive global feminist movement. So famously, second-wave feminist American, the American second-wave feminist Kate Millett and her then partner, the Canadian photographer Sophie Keir, went to Iran to be part of the International Women's Day protests. Their presence there and Millett's desire and insistence on speaking at that protest ultimately backfired for Iranian feminists. And I think the presence of Western feminists played right into the hands of the Islamic regime that placed Iranian women into that impossible position of choosing between feminism and loyalty to the nation. In addition to that, in addition to Millett's presence, there were a contingent of European women from a French organization presided over by Simone de Beauvoir, who went to Rome and demanded an audience with Khomeini to sort of question him, interrogate him on the hijab. And he met with them for 5 minutes of complete silence. He refused to engage with them. And they walked away from that, meeting, proving the regime's line that those who argue against hijab are foreign agents or westernized elements, disconnected from the rest of Iranian society. So at that time, I think that global sisterhood movement significantly harmed the Iranian women's movement. So what's different now? What we're seeing today with young women leading these protests, and sometimes, we see so many joyful scenes and as well as angry scenes of these young women removing their veils, swinging them over their heads, tossing them into a fire, is this total rejection and dismantling of the binary model of tradition versus modernity, East versus West, that the Iranian cultural and political landscape has struggled with throughout the 20th century. Where, as panelists before me have suggested, we're witnessing something remarkable right now with all these videos and footage coming out of Iran. These incredibly brave and incredibly young women, schoolgirls, trampling on their veils, tearing up photos of Khomeini and Khamenei, setting fire to them. This is a tech-savvy generation attuned to the power of the visual rhetoric of resistance. They're filming themselves, importantly, I think, in the space of the classroom, writing Zan Zendegi Azadi on the blackboard. You know, in one video that I just saw this morning, a young schoolgirl is senior, sort of, she shows herself reaching up to flip over the photograph of Khomeini, and on the back is Zan Zendegi Azadi. I mean, it's just visually so incredibly powerful. You know, other videos we've seen of a group of schoolgirls, you know, with their unveiled and their photos taken from the back, and they're raising the middle finger to the image of Khamenei. So these videos and photographs are going viral, and they're inspiring protesters nationally and internationally. Young Iranian women are rejecting Iranian political and cultural systems that have historically considered women's rights as an afterthought, and are uncompromisingly placing women's demands for bodily autonomy at the forefront of this movement. While they welcome the support of men in the struggle, they're not allowing women's voices and women's demands to be subsumed under men's voices. So, for example, for a brief time, the slogan Zan Zendegi Azadi was followed by Mard Mihan Abadi, an effort on the part of men, I think, to generalize the resistance movement to a broader demand for freedom, but it didn't. The slogan did not gain traction, and I think that's fascinating and wonderful. The Iranian women of this generation are no longer tolerating the co-optation of their movement, not from Iranian men and not from women in the West. So I do believe we're witnessing at this point a transformative moment of feminist global solidarity. This young generation of Iranian women is showing us all how to come together, how to move forward without fear. Feminists in the West are watching and supporting from afar rather than instructing Iranian women on what feminism looks like. They're actually following their lead. Iranian women have created these powerful symbols of protest, such as cutting their hair. And Iranian women in the diaspora and feminists also in the West are reenacting these moments in a show of respect and support for the Iranian feminist movement. So I think these young women are the leaders of what appears to be a truly grassroots feminist movement, and its repercussions are reverberating intergenerationally as well as internationally. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Professor Naghibi. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Fariba Bashiri. Dr. Bashiri is a medical doctor and the president of the Iranian Women's Organization of Ontario, which she's been a member of since 2014. In 2018, she founded the organization's mental health committee. She's held various positions, including a medical doctor, university instructor, researcher, as well as social and human rights activist in Iran, and is currently working as a teacher assistant at the Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine. She is the author of 4 books on women's rights and alternative medicine. Dr. Bashiri, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Leila. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Dr. Tavakoli and University of Toronto and all of my incredible panelists. Woman Life Freedom, Zan Zendegi Azadi. 22 years old woman, Mahsa Amini, died on September 16 while in police custody. She was apprehended in Iran by the country's morality police for unsuitable dress, apparently wearing a hijab improperly and breaking a strictly enforced dress code. It wasn't the first time that Iranian morality police doing this type of apprehended. They are doing this for more than 40 years. It is not only about hijab. They are cutting all human rights in every way they could, especially about women. In Iran, government police and members have right to decide and force about all people dress, rating, and whatever is a woman and man essential rights. A student has to follow these rules at a school, university, and even work. All world is witness Iranian people objection and protest from 40 years ago, time to time, and are still silent and wait. Now they, especially young generation, are tired and cannot tolerate anymore. They want an ordinary life, nothing more than that. But this time is different because Mahsa died in custody, a young woman that traveled from Kurdistan with her brother to Tehran for having a leisure time. She had hijab, but morality police doesn't accept that and want to abandon it. Mahsa Amini begged and shot that she is a traveler and a stranger in Tehran. They didn't care and harmed her, tortured her, and she died. That time, Mahsa Amini didn't know that she wasn't a stranger. She had a world of brothers and sisters like you. That don't let the voice of her voice forget. Women and are a family's fundamental root. Half of world are women and woman born second half. Woman right is top of human right because killing these rights affect all people's rights. If a woman is get out from society, the society isn't a healthy one anymore. Iranian Women Organization of Ontario is a non-political organization and work to protect Iranian Canadian women and families' rights, empower them, and take care of their mental health and wellness. Today, I'm here to say that we and Iranian Women Organization stand against all human and women rights cuts. Iranian Canadian people stand against who want to break these rights. Now Iranian Canadian people doesn't feel good. They are sick about what happens in Iran. They have concern about their families and homeland. They affected mentally with this news. It isn't political issue. We cannot give any suggestion or request about Iranian government because only Iranian people in Iran can decide about that. But we can stand with them to protect human rights and be their voice. This is humanity. So, thank you, Zindagi.
Thank you, Dr. Bashiri. There was a little bit of sound problems, but I think we got most of the talk. So we're going to begin to do the Q&A, and I think how we're going to do this is I ask folks to drop their questions in the chat. I'm going to begin with the questions that have already been dropped in. So we'll start that way, and then we'll hopefully be able to open it up soon. So I'll read the first 4 questions. They're addressed to various speakers. So some of them are open to all of the speakers. So I'll read them slowly, and then I'll open it up to the 4 speakers to respond. So the first question is for Dr. Hoodfar. The question is about the question asked, do you think the revolution versus reform paradigm is itself a problem? first question. The second question is for Professor Tajali. And the question reads, will external support in the form of sanctions and formal condemnation of repressive measures promote the cause of women's struggles? It continues, sanctions have further strengthened the hardline camps. Internal and spontaneous movements, in my view, stand a better chance of leading the reform. Your thoughts? The third question, as well as the fourth question, are open to all of the speakers. So the third question is, do you see this revolt by women of Iran as different than previous ones, in that it may actually create a reform or amazing change? And the last question is, how do you think this feminist movement relates to the LGBTQ plus community in Iran? So Professor Hoodfar, if you don't mind starting, and then I'll leave it to you guys.
Well, thank you for the question. I guess that's on the mind of a lot of us, reform versus revolution. But it all depends how we define reform. And the point is, the regime has had chances during Fatemeh, and then in 2009, and then during Rouhani's. In every stand, the regime has shown that it is deaf to the demand of the public. So in that way, in my mind, the kind of reform of a slow change has passed. If we define reform as a complete structural change, because I think that is what is needed in Iran, the structure of the state has to change. Now, that can happen through a revolution of completely ousting this state, or it can happen by totally reorganizing the structure. What is needed at this point and what is demanded by people is a structural change of the state. When the power is in the hand of one person with no answering to no one, and being able to just exercise any kind of power once, doesn't matter who it is, even if it is the best person sitting there, it will get corrupted. The point is that system, the constitution, the state structure needs to be to change. Now, whether we like to call it revolution or a reform, or how this may happen, it is really nothing. It's really the only thing that satisfies the need of society today in that sense. So I think this is kind of a little bit of a false question. We have to see what do we need to change, and that the answer to the protest and to the public is really relies on that. Thank you.
Yes, do you want me to go ahead and answer? Yes, okay. Yes, with regards to sanctions, I completely agree that sanctions have had far-reaching negative consequences onto the public, onto the Iranians. And there's many amazing scholars even within this room right now who have researched on that, who have written about it and have talked about it. And I completely agree. And I think it's very it's important for us to keep in mind that as though some of these sanctions that are so against medicine, against airplane parts and so on and so forth, it's as though it's punishing the Iranian people for their government. And when we're talking about an authoritarian regime, we do know that these have literal effect on those individuals. So yes, and in fact, I fought very hard to have my book be published as open access, specifically because I knew transactions between Iran and the West are so limited. But on the other hand, I think it's important for us to note that there are, some sort of condemnation on behalf of these groups, the IRGC and so on, that could have sort of travel bans. Those types of sanctions might be helpful and beneficial in order to at least, elevate those particular voices. What we do know with Iran is that, and I would say not just Iran, including in neighboring Afghanistan, including in neighboring Iraq, foreign intervention rarely does anything good. In fact, it does a lot of, it just turns back the clock on so many ways, including what's just happening with the Taliban in Afghanistan right now. So in fact, some of these sanctions that are harmful to the population should be illegal under international human rights law. And there's work on that to be done, but unfortunately, it's not necessarily happening. What needs to be happening, however, is sort of elevating those voices, either with internet, either with support of social media. With my own research, I've been able to see, so I work on women and political participation and women's access to the formal political levels. And I've been able to see that whenever relations between United States and between the West, let's say, and Iran improves in some way, that's when we have openings, we have sort of windows of opportunity to have individuals that enter from within the state that actually advocate for some of these key issues. Like, for instance, the previous parliament in Iran, which was in power from 2016 all the way to 2020, was an important parliament in the sense that we had a lot of candidates that entered from the list of hope. This was the hope that was right after the nuclear deal. And we did see some who I call critical actors, or women that entered the parliament that actually were responsive to some of the demands that they were hearing from, including, let's say, the Girls of the Revolution Street on mandatory veiling. And they actually began to talk about it and discuss it. And that's what I discuss in my Washington Post article, because I saw that it seems to be a lot of the focus is on just like external factors. But in fact, when we're talking about the Iranian state, is not a monolith. You could have different sort of voices within that. And it's important for us to acknowledge those and see how those can come about. I do want to also comment on the LGBTQ one, but I can do you want me to go ahead with that now? Okay, yes. I think that's absolutely essential for us to also keep in mind. And in fact, I see that when we're talking about feminist movements, and of course, the particular protests that are happening right now that are just so central on women's bodies and sort of sexuality, it would be, it's absolutely essential for that discourse to widen, to also include sexual minorities, to also include LGBTQ rights. And in fact, I do think the opportunity is there and it's ripe, particularly among the youth of Iran, to really take this on seriously. And it reminds me of Homa's comment at the beginning, that if this revolution, if the social revolution is not going to be encompassing of these much wider discriminatory rulings and practices, could we call it a revolution for all? And we do see in the Muslim context, we are seeing important changes. I mean, there is a political party in Turkey that I've studied, which is the pro-Kurdish the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, the HDP, that has a gender quota for LGBTQ rights. It has a 10% gender quota for that particular group. And that just led to them becoming extremely popular among the youth, among the intellectuals. So I think what's happening here is that there's a lot of sort of resistance or hesitancy on behalf of some sections of the society that maybe the time is not right. I just want to remind us that if we say the time is not right, how is this any different from 1979 when Homa's friends were telling her the time is not right for us to talk about women's issues? So I just wanted to put that out there.
Professor Shams and Professor Naghibi, would you want to speak to the question
Sure.
of the differences between this moment and previous moments, as well as more on LGBT?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to pick on Dr. Jalili's point, Tajali's point, excuse me. I think this is, and this is about the LGBTQ rights. I think this is this movement is about the emancipation of all marginalized bodies, not only women. And that's important to keep in mind. And I think I mentioned about the Kurdish origins of the slogan, but again, as we see today, really different ethnic minorities, religious minorities, women, marginalized bodies, LGBTQ, everybody has joined this movement at this point. I think this is a revolution. I have made this point several times in the past few days in different interviews. There is a fundamental shift in the values. There is a generational shift. There is a fundamental shift in terms of the values and in terms of the imaginations and reclaiming that space that these women have come, inch by inch over the past 4 decades in order to reclaim this space in the streets and making, sort of burning their veils. This has started, back in the 1980s. So it's important to realize that, this occupying the streets, the way that these women have in the past 3 weeks, is a revolutionary act. There is, of course, no, meaningful division still in the body of the state. I think in the state apparatus. And I think Khamenei's speech made it very clear what is his message. The message is a militant response and a violent crackdown on the civil society at any cost. Coming out with his army was basically, to me, is the shape of a coup against the civil society in Iran. So I think that when we are talking about revolutions, we of course have to include the factor that, has there been a serious divide in the state? The answer is no to this point. And I think that brings us to the next point, that, what is the responsibility of this transnational movement, of this movement? Because we are dealing with a brutally militant state apparatus that is not willing to compromise on its values, as Raisi put it a few days ago. So I think, one thing, I think there's an important questions in the Q&A about, is this in the Western media, we see that this is a predominantly middle class movement. This is honestly complete nonsense. And I think it's very misleading to call this a middle class movement. I was very active in the 2009 uprising. That was a middle class movement. And we had a very middle class slogan as well. There was a middle class demand of having a democratic electoral system. We believed in our sort of democratic right in the society. We were still talking about democracy. We're not talking about revolution in that sense. It was called a green revolution at some point. I don't think it was a revolution, at least in its fundamental and initial aspirations, right? Not afterwards. Afterwards, it advanced to a more revolutionary sort of reaction to the state. But this one is revolutionary. This one is about its aspiration, its slogan, its demands are revolutionary, and it's coming from the Kurdish, originates in the Kurdish provinces, but at this point, different ethnic and religious minorities and different gender, whoever identifies in whatever gender are part of this movement, and talking about sanctions at this point in the way that has been framed in the past couple of days, particularly following the Khamenei's speech. We see a shift in the Western media outlets that now they're suddenly talking about the economic grievances being in the forefront of this movement and the main cause. I think that's the manipulation and co-option of this revolution, and it has to be limited. It has to be confronted by those of us who are vocal about this situation. I consider it as a deliberate shift in the narrative in order to make deals with the Islamic Republic in order to move forward. We have to be very diligent, I think, about this change of narrative. Yes, sanctioning Iranian people always has been condemned. We always openly condemn that. But sanctioning the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps that deliberately shot down a 176, excuse me, I've been talking a lot, 176 passengers, innocent passengers in the sky for their heinous operation that against the states following the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. They have an open case in the international court at this point, and this organization has become the face of this opposition. And people from all corners of the world have been donating to their campaign because they consider it as the very legitimate representative of various layers of crimes that this state has committed. So I think it's really, really important. We have to find ways to limit these normalizers of these atrocities in the media outlets, and also those who are trying to mislead and twist the conversation towards something else, such as sanctions.
Thank you, Professor Shams. Are there other comments before I move on to the next set of questions? Dr. Rashir, Professor Naghibi? Okay. So there's a whole cluster of questions that I'm going to stick together that are about how we in the diaspora can show support for protesters in Iran, whether it's Western feminists or academics, or, this question is coming up a lot by different figures. So I wanted to just open that question up to all of the panelists of how different sectors of society outside of Iran, both Iranians and non-Iranians, can show support and solidarity to what is happening on the ground. There was also another question about credible media sources during this time. The question asks for English ones, but I think that question can be posed also for Persian media sources that are out there. So that's the second question. And the third question is, since clerics have penetrated all institutions of society, how will they relinquish this hold in the face of these revolutionary protests? So if we can begin, I'll leave it up to you guys to decide who wants to go first. Perhaps Professor Naghibi, you haven't spoken yet, the question of diasporic solidarity as well as general solidarity from the outside.
Sure, thank you so much, Elahé. I think this is such an important question, and I think it's this went very wrong, in 1979, right? As I mentioned in my remarks, I think the intentions were good. The intentions at that time of global feminists or who wanted to show their solidarity and support for their Iranian, sisters, was well-intentioned, but it was predicated on this model of global sisterhood that actually has a very long colonial history that goes back to colonial missionaries, in the 19th century, who went to Iran and other countries in the Middle East and looked at women in veils, and for them that was like the ultimate symbol of oppression, and they saw it as their duty to liberate women from the shackles of the veil and thereby enlighten them and set them free. The difference now, and I think we've learned our lessons from that moment. I think people in the diaspora, those of us in the diaspora, and Western feminists are sensitive to not speaking for women in Iran and not setting up some kind of ideal model of feminism and feminist activism. I think social media in this way is actually quite helpful because we're seeing directly, from Iran what these brave young women are doing on the ground. And it frankly, I personally feel humbled by their fearlessness and their bravery. And I think so I feel like the probably the most productive way of showing solidarity is by circulating the information that's coming out of Iran, not trying to correct it or position or put forward another model of feminism that that really doesn't apply, that wouldn't be seen as that wouldn't be seen as relevant, right, in the Iranian context. So I think just circulating what is happening in Iran, I think is really, and just expressing support, I think is really the most productive and helpful gesture of solidarity, in my view.
Other thoughts? Professor Hoodfar?
Well, I just wanted, thank you, Nima, for bringing this up. I also wanted to mention, because sometimes, especially maybe from well-intentioned but kind of conventional way, that people assume that they immediately attribute things to Western feminism. Per se, feminism has learned also a lot since then. Transnational women's movement is not now made up of only Western women. And I think the fact that women's movement in Iran has become transnationalized, they have access to a lot of places and ideas. They can contribute. There's a difference between expressing support and intervention. I have been asked several times. I think it's the worst thing. I always remind people that we don't want any Western society to intervene. At the same time, we don't want them to use this opportunity to make better deal for themselves with the regime and basically save the regime once more. But I think sometimes people do just use this conventional way of accusing Western feminism and all that. They basically take away from the courage and understanding of the people on the ground who are actually doing the act and showing the fact that they are acting on their own account, not you and I or even Western or others. I'm sure all these young women probably have never even heard about feminism as such or read any feminist, but it's what they feel. In a way, they are also taking, I feel the movement presently feels like taking one's country back. I mean, the people want their country back. Like it's almost a sense of anti-colonial movement that I see in this movement, in this context. People feel their country has not been theirs, not just now, but for a couple of generations, and they want it back. And I think that's the important aspect that we have to maybe talk about it a little bit more. I mean, for those of us who have done field work, this sense of we lost our country has always been there. But I think young people are now wanting to express it and fight it back and take it back, and we should honor them for that. Thank you.
If I have had something, I totally agree with Dr. Hoodfar, but I am saying that this time the women that have in this protest and want a right don't remember the revolution. They are so young people. They are the young generation, and they want only an ordinary life. They want to do that. That everything is their right. I don't care, as Dr. Hoodfar said, about the Iranian government, but we have to be their voice to protect their rights. It is the world responsibility that continue these voices, not stop, because they need support. They need that their voice be spread in the world. They don't have access to internet even. So this generation is different from us. These are, they want their own rights. They want to live free. They want to study. They want to work that way they want. So we have to be their voice and continue this kind of session until, as my colleagues told, until we get some result from this type of protest. Thank you.
I just wanted to add a couple of points following on Dr. Naghibi and Dr. Hoodfar's points. I think what's really, really important is that we constantly keep reminding ourselves that this revolution has its own very unique form, and trying to impose theoretical frameworks, trying to compare it constantly with other movements. It's okay to some extent, I think, but I think this is a very unique form of emancipatory feminist revolution. And I think this constant longing for Western feminists to speak up and come and give us a model, or collaboration is very important, don't get me wrong, but just having this constant yearning for someone else coming telling us what to do, I think it's very problematic, to be honest, and really feeds into that colonialist, orientalist, new orientalist gaze. So that's one thing I just wanted to say. And, just what Dr. Bashiri said, that these children, I mean, including our generation, the 1980s, we haven't seen the revolution. We don't know how it looked like. Everybody, we have been in the archives writing books about it, trying to understand this traumatic experience that, changed our lives forever and the life of our mothers forever. But we haven't seen it. And I think this is what, what we're witnessing right now. This is the revolutionary moment for this generation. And this again, I think what Dr. Hoodfar is saying about the anti-colonial movement is really important and very, very I think extremely enlightening to keep in mind that, I've written about this before, that, this government has been colonizing and the dead bodies, the cemeteries for 4 decades. They have colonized mass graves. They have colonized the bodies of those who were killed in the Green Uprising, and they tried to call them Shaheed. They colonized the bodies of 176 passengers, and they wanted to put the Shaheed label on the. And now you see the mother of Nikasha Karami coming to her funeral and chanting, shouting her daughter's name, saying that my daughter was Shahadat al-Mubarak, Shahadat al-Mubarak. So you see, I think this is the revolutionary change in the discourse and in the language of the revolution as well, not just the figurative language, but also the very core of the revolutionary slogans and the sort of the discourse of war and the so-called sacred defense. So I think, we really need to just watch closely. And my only fear, and I share it with you because this is something that is really, I think, deeply concerning, is that the transnational aspect is really important, circulation being their voice. My concern is that the internet will be further and further limited, and by the nationalization and domestication of the internet, the security web, the web security and all that, contribute into just having less and less access. Those who are on the ground are constantly worried about this, and this is a real concern. I think we really need to push the international community in order to give free access or provide the way, the means for the Iranians to have access to free internet. And that will be the key for us to be the sort of the reflection of their voice rather than, trying to change it or shape it in any way.
Thank you. I'll continue to try and cluster questions together as much